Hello, and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown, and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Peter.
April in the garden. So, Chris, what are we thinking about for April?
My word, yes, April comes around very quickly, and it's always a mixture weather-wise, isn't it, Peter?
Definitely. Spring is in the air, and sometimes it's a storm, and the next day it's a lovely sunny day.
Yeah, those I would say those spring showers can catch us unaware, but for gardeners it's a great time. It's warming up. That's the most important thing.
I think one of the best things about gardening, Chris, is in a way it's a bit like painting or a lot of hobbies where you get a blank canvas sometimes, or maybe an established canvas, and you just want to change something. So sometimes you might want to maybe create a new border.
Indeed, and isn't it in gardening that your garden is never finished? That's what they always say.
Definitely.
But this is a perfect time of creating new borders, or basically maybe adding to an existing border, or just revamping an existing space you have. And of course, as we're in the month of April, the soil's nice and warm now, hopefully. We've had a little bit of rain, but not too much. And the soil conditions are really good for planting a whole host of things, including a lot of evergreens.
Okay. What sort of things should we be thinking about if we want to create a new border? I guess same as normal, start with the soil and put some compost and...
Indeed, yeah, and have a look at if it's a new border, have a look at the aspect as well. See how much sun's going to actually hit the soil. That's quite important, because obviously certain plants need specific sort of conditions. So if you're in a nice sunny border, then obviously you'll have a much wider choice of plants, and you might be restricted if it's shady. But there again, come to the garden centre, most plants these days are labelled in such a way that they'll always indicate which conditions they need. And also think about your soil. Obviously, North Buckinghamshire, we're on Buckingham clay.
Yeah.
Like it or not.
It's not great for growing plants sometimes, is it?
No, so it might need a bit of extra TLC to get it improved. And then, stamp out. Just decide from what you want to get from the border. Do you want a nice display of flowers? Do you want an evergreen backdrop which looks good all the year round? Do you want to inject lots of fragrance? Do you want to make the border mixed? So you're going to put in things like roses, shrubs, perennials. Just question exactly what you want. And of course, we all get inspiration, whether it's watching, Gardener's World, or reading through our gardening columns in the newspapers and magazines. Just, sit down with the family as well. Talk about what you'd like as a collective.
Excellent. Okay. And obviously, one area of the garden that I can remember when I was at Pershore, there was past the course, and it had a whole big module on roses. I know at the school I can remember there was a lovely rose garden, and in the summer you go through the rose garden and it was very ornate and regimented, but the flowers were lovely smelling, sort of blooms. And are roses still something we should be thinking about? And obviously, are they as popular as they were 20, 30 years ago?
Indeed, and I think they're having such a resurgence over the last few years.
Okay.
I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, they were incredibly popular. They sort of waned a little bit in the 80s, and sort of mid-90s, I think that was the crucial time when you had people and growers like David Austin and Peter Beals showing those amazing displays at like the Chelsea Flower Show, and suddenly we were into a whole sort of gamut of new types of roses, the shrub roses as they're called. Okay,
because a lot of plantings these days, as in borders, you quite often see roses in the borders, and they're not so much sort of big old formal rose gardens where you just have roses in that bed. And is there anything we need to be thinking about this time of year with regards to roses?
Yes, well, all the pruning should all be done now, and it's really keeping your roses in tip-top form. So it's all about, giving them a feed. If you haven't already fed them, give them a nice granular fertiliser. And then obviously look at the general health of your roses. Incredibly greedy are our roses when you plant them. I mean, they take a lot of nutrients up. And if you think about when you prune a rose back in February, March, it puts all that extension growth which flowers. Many rose varieties are now what they call repeat flowering, so you get one flush followed by a secondary flush. So in between, you need to give them some extra feed as well. All this growth, of course, is a wonderful magnet to pests and diseases.
Right. And with regards to the fertiliser, are we going farmyard manure or grow more or
yes,
fish blood and bone? What's the go-to one? I mean, Top Rose is a product that springs to mind.
Perfect.
Presumably is specific to roses?
It is. It's very much so. It's the Rolls Royce of fertilizers. If you're going to give your roses, if you like your roses that much, certainly Top Roses up there. Obviously formulated. It's got all the what they call the trace elements. It's got manganese and boron, all the other bits and bobs which roses need. However, there's products like RoseVitax Q4 on the market which are particularly good, and Bloodfish and Bone is actually fine. But I think you've got to think about, because of this massive amount of growth they put on, if you can give them a nice balanced food, with all these micronutrients and trace elements, you'll find your roses are prolific, they're nice and green and healthy, and that of course will deter a lot of the pests and diseases as well.
Brilliant. Chris, we sell masses of bedding plants in cell packs in here. Is it about this time of year, or are we still a bit early for planting bedding at the moment?
It's interesting, isn't it? Most of the bedding plants, or seasonal plants as we like to call them, tend to come in March and April. But of course, it's the hardiness of each of those plants which we have to look upon to see whether we can actually plant them out. A lot of the early things like your fuchsias, your geraniums, we would stock in as little plug plants, which would need a little bit of protection from the frost. However, certainly in the last few weeks, we've had things like Antirrhinums in stock. Good old Snapdragons.
I remember growing those as a child because, am I allowed to say this? You pick the flower off and you squeeze it.
That's it.
And it goes snap. And
it does.
As a sort of 6-7-year-old boy, I was very pleased with that. And my brother and I used to run around the garden chasing each other with our little dragons.
Excellent memories. Yeah, of course. But there are other plants in that sort of grouping. Even the likes of Alyssum and Lobelia are deemed as quite tough. It's only when you get into things like begonias and petunias, gazanias, and some of the other more tender varieties, marigolds especially, good old French and African marigolds, they have to hear the word frost and they'll curl their toes. So
my favourite plant, the gerbera, that's one that's probably best left a little bit longer.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, no. So those, yes, you need to be thinking about those. I mean, obviously, some of the bedding plants we get these days, things like Cosmos, I mean, they're incredibly popular. I'm sure we're all familiar with those big sort of daisy flowers.
They're lovely, aren't they?
And it's interesting, one question we do seem to get asked at the garden centre is about how to keep them nice and compact.
Okay. And are there any tricks that you can give us for bedding plants and sort of keeping them compact? I know one of the projects I did was growing dwarf sunflowers many years ago, and that was to do with the seed, and it was a new variety that had been bred for bedding purposes, and so rather than getting a normal 6 foot tall, it only got to about, I'm going to say, 3 foot tall. Mine only probably got to 2 foot tall.
Yeah.
But anyway,
perfect.
What tricks and what keeps the bedding plants these days that little bit smaller? Yeah,
I mean, yes, choosing the varieties is important. I think Cosmos Sonata is the one we tend to have at the garden centre, and you can buy the seeds of it, but when you grow it in your greenhouse, it tends to get quite long and leggy. Now, the commercial growers that will actually use a chemical. It's basically a growth reduction chemical called cyclocel, or sometimes called B9, and that stops the cells from, instead of etiolating, it makes them go horizontal.
So for the novice who doesn't understand that technology, that means it goes sideways rather than up.
Yeah, so you get short, stubby little plants rather than tall, lanky sunflower type flowers.
Okay.
Yeah. And it works really well, but of course us gardeners can't get hold of those sort of products. So the best thing we can do is to actually rotate the growing tips out of your little bedding plants to make them bush up at a younger stage.
Okay, and that's not going to affect the number of flowers they have?
Nope.
So can you get a multi-headed sunflower if you did that to a sunflower?
You could, yes. It would become basically a multi-stemmed plant. It would do that. Wow. And with things like Cosmos, and there's quite a lot of the bedding plants, that actually is better for the smaller garden anyway, because you'll get more flower. All right, it'll be delayed probably a few weeks, but that's not a problem. I mean, we often suggest doing that for things like fuchsias and geraniums anyway, by pinching out to keep the plants nice and compact. And I think that's important, especially when you are limited for space.
Brilliant. Thanks for that tip, Chris. Plants that are flowering seems to take a lot of energy. Is that a good rule of thumb there, Chris? And presumably when you've got your flowers in full bloom, or your plants in full bloom, should I say rather, you should be feeding them?
You should, and I suppose at this time of year when things, especially spring flowering plants like your camellias, your rhododendrons, even your forsythia, which is looking great in our gardens, presently, that just needs that extra feed. And the general rule of thumb is, yes, you should feed them usually directly after flowering. However, things like camellias especially, and maybe rhododendrons in pots, which a lot of people grow them on their patio or terrace, they will actually benefit from a nice ericaceous feed. And obviously ericaceous feeds, for those not in the know, it's all about what the product contains to get the best from that soil, because obviously they are lime-free plants, so you don't want to be giving them additives to the fertilizer, which is going to cause problems later on. And the other thing you might want to look at with your camellias especially is that in a pot they can go quite yellow, or you get this sort of yellow markings to the leaves, and sometimes brown sort of splodges.
Okay.
Sometimes it's the lower leaves, but it can actually affect the whole plant, and that's generally meaning that the plant is a bit sickly. And because it's an ericaceous plant, it needs extra iron, so it's a bit like us. Sometimes we need a bit of extra iron in our supplements.
Yep.
Exactly. So you get yourself some CompostRosesRose iron tonic, sachet or a spoonful of that in your watering can, and that should sort the problem out. It'll green the plant up really well, very, very quickly.
Brilliant. We've had quite a few days with some really high winds recently, and obviously spring's the time for spring showers, and that can really soak the ground, and obviously that can batter plants a bit, can't they? Can't it, Chris? Is that something we should think about?
Yeah, especially your perennials, which are popping through now. I was looking around my garden the other day, and things like peonies are starting to pop through. So it's always worth trying to get some sort of staking around the plants nice and early.
Okay. Now, from memory, there's like these sort of rings with grids in them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that really describes them well. And they basically adjust to the height of the plants as they grow. So you put the rods in, and then, you just bring the ring through, pop the shoots through those, and then as the plant extends, then you just move the ring up to give the plant nice, good support right through. Obviously, it'd be early plants starting to grow now, but a little bit later on in sort of into May next month and beyond, you might have to start doing that sort of process for things like solidago, coreopsis, some of those things like delphiniums, which produce those amazing towering stems.
Yep.
Those might just need a little bit of protection early on with a stake.
That's a good idea, Chris. And I know in the garden I've seen quite a few people who make these wigwams out of, is it old hazel twigs?
Yes, hazel sticks, yes.
What's that for?
Yeah, I mean, you can use willow as well. It's just a naturalistic way of using your material in your garden, especially if you coppice your hazel back. But bear in mind that obviously hazel is a living thing, so if you use them as sticks, there's a good chance they're going to grow and root.
Yeah. So is it best to sort of leave them, cut them, and then use them the following year rather than cut them and stick them in the ground straight away for your new wigwam?
I think you'd be tempting fate if you did it straight away. So yes, leave them and let them dry out a little bit, and then you'll have some nice natural material, which obviously has not cost you anything. You've recycled or upcycled from your garden, and you'll have something which will look very naturalistic too. And you can use that then for all your top-heavy plants during the summer.
Give them some good wind protection. That's a
Perfect.
good idea, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, over the last few years, there's been a big push to create areas in your garden which are wildlife friendly, and certain things we can do to help the wildlife and the birds and the bees. So I noticed in my mother's garden, she often leaves her hydrangeas to sort of go brown and look a bit dead. Why would she be doing that? Yeah,
no, it's a very good point. A lot of people do that, and it's all about protecting the top of the plant.
Okay.
So you're using that skeletal sort of foliage through the winter, and it, in a way, acts like a little sort of canopy to stop.
It makes its own little microclimate above the hydrangea, sort of on the hydrangea stem.
Basically, yes.
Keeps it a bit warmer. That's a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's always a bit contentious when you come to actually snip those mop heads off.
And when would you recommend it? Is that something we should be doing now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, take a look at the weather forecast. I mean, I think April's going to be a little bit variable, to say the least, long-term wise. So if it's looking like we're going to get some late frost, I perhaps would leave it another 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, because we can, just thinking about the sort of microclimate, it looks like forecast is snow showers in a week's time or so. So I guess April, check the weather forecast before
Yeah.
chopping your hydrangeas
Yes, yeah.
and tidying up.
But when you do chop them, leave them around the garden. So if you've got an area, just leave them around because, again, anecdotally and from my observations as well for birds nesting, they tend to take those amazing sort of structures from the mop and use them for bedding material.
Wow. That's really interesting. Last weekend I was doing the allotment, Chris, and
good.
First time this year to really get down there and get stuck in. I took the rotavator down.
Excellent.
And started attacking the beds and my weeds.
Right, okay.
Am I doing the right thing? What do we need to be thinking about vegetable-wise? Because I know this time of the year I generally start planting things up. And I took my potatoes home a couple of weeks ago, and they're in egg crates in the conservatory, just growing. Well, they're starting to chit now.
Perfect.
Can I plant my sweet corn?
Oh, yeah. So this time of the year, it's more the tender sort of veg, like your sweet corn.
Okay.
You can start putting those into seed trays or into pots. I mean, actually, sweet corn always does best if you put like a couple of seeds per pot. So 9 centimetre, 3.5 inch pot. Yep. Good quality compost. Pop those on the windowsill. Although some of the gardening books tell you to take both of them out, I always let both germinate and grow at each planting station. But yes, your cucumbers as well, if you're growing cucumbers, especially the more expensive F1 hybrid varieties, like Peppernecks and some of the more compact varieties where you just get a very small fruit, they can be sown now. And of course your tomatoes, it's not too late at all to get your tomatoes sown and get those on there. But basically, it's, as you say, we're into the main sowing period now, so lots of things you can start composting.
Now, Chris, you'll probably be horrified by this. I save my cell packs when I buy my bedding, because I haven't planted it as a seed and I've gone to the garden centre and bought it. I save my old cell packs in my old pots, and surprise, surprise, I reuse them.
Great.
Is that okay? Is there anything I should be doing? I mean...
Yeah, I think maybe just make sure they're clean. Perhaps run them under a bit of disinfectant just to make sure they're completely clean. But no, upcycling those trays is good. I mean, they'll probably last you a couple of seasons before they do.
They eventually fall apart, generally because of sort of sun damage on them from them being left floating around the garden.
But I think as gardeners, though, we are more conscious of the plastics we use in the garden. So if we can reutilise them for a number of years, then that's so much the better until they run out of their natural life. But that certainly, if you've got those sort of trays, if you've got the sort of 20 or 40 or just a 6-pack, you can multi-sow into those things like, obviously, your broad beans. If you want to grow those under protection, you can do that, of course. That keeps a little bit of time. But a lot of people will be direct sowing now. So as long as your soil is a good tilth, so it's nicely broken down, you can start sowing quite nicely right through the month of April. And obviously you might want a head start by having a few things growing on the windowsill as a backup plan if things don't go quite to plan in the open garden.
Because there's certain vegetables that you have to sow them every couple of weeks, and that way you get a good...
Yeah, successional planting, that's the term, isn't it? Yeah, and lettuce, I suppose, is probably the biggest one there. In fact, I think lettuce and maybe spring onions and perhaps radish would come under those criteria. So yeah, please don't sow a whole row of lettuce unless you want to consume many heads in a week.
So, just a few at a time at this, and that'll give you a good crop. Now, something that I learnt, I don't know, you'll probably say you don't need to do this, but I love Enorma'Multi-cell beans. And in order to get them to germinate well, I soak them generally in a plastic bag, sort of with some damp tissue paper overnight, and then sew them up, sort of put them in the pots in the compost the next day. Yep. Is that recommended? And is there any other vegetable seeds that benefit from doing?
Yeah, no, anything which can help to sort of swell the seed before sowing is good. Sweet peas can be done that way. I've done that many times with sweet peas and even garden peas. I think it's all about, it's that leap of faith, isn't it? Sowing directly when the seed is, if it's, it's seed which has been around for a year or two perhaps, rather than fresh seed, that can have a bit of an appliance on there. But I think generally, when you are sowing, just make sure the drill you're sowing into is well watered. If you do that, but no, there's nothing wrong with if the larger seeds, you can actually obviously give them a short spell in water, but don't overdo it. They want to be,
they're just wrapped in moist tissue paper. They're not drowned.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed. I remember years and years ago when I first came into gardening, they used to do fluid drilling. So what they did, they pre-germinated things like parsnip seeds. So they started them on blotting paper.
Right.
And seed trays, so you'd start to see the radicle, that first sort of root
that breaks through the outside of the seed.
That's it, yep. And then what they do then is get some very safe, plain wallpaper paste and add the seeds to the seedlings as they were effectively, or sprouted seeds, into that, and then pipe the wallpaper paste containing the seeds into the drill. And they were pre-germinated. Now, parsnips are a nightmare to germinate anyway. They can take 6-8 weeks to come through the soil. But this way was a lot more precise. It's disappeared. I've never heard any reference to it in recent years. But at the time, this was in the 1970s, it was very, very popular.
Because I've seen seed tapes. Is that another benefit? I mean, seed tapes they're more expensive when you see them in the packets. Are they any better? Yeah,
and again, I think it's just aiming at for gardeners who really don't want to sow the seeds very, very thinly, because they're basically at each sort of 6 inches, 15 centimetres or less pre-marked. You have obviously a small amount of seed sort of fixed in this tape. So when they germinate through, they come through the soil. Of course, they're already at their regimented spacings. So you don't have to.
So it does save you a bit of work. But
yeah, I think you'd be probably better doing them into your multi-cell trays and starting them off and doing them that way, and then cost-wise would be better, and you could have a bit more control over the varieties, especially because it's quite restricted, the varieties you can get in seed tapes.
Yeah, because I'd give you a bit more information on my professional seed growing techniques. No, I'm joking. I've got a propagator that I have in my conservatory. If it's not too hot, or if it's going to be a hot day, I put it outside. I don't have a sort of very fancy propagator. It's just literally an unheated one. But I did find that last few years since I've got it, it does make a massive difference to the sort of germination rate. And I know historically, so I can remember here, grandfather covering trays of plants or trays of pots with compost and seed in with sheets of glass. Is there anything else that?
Yeah, it's all about bringing that warmth into it and trying to keep the temperature around the seed a little bit higher within the pot. So yes, you're going to raise the temperature by a few degrees. I mean, the lift in a propagator can be just 2 or 3 degrees, which might be enough to trigger better germination, especially if you've got your propagator near on a windowsill where there's a radiator. So you're getting the benefit from that. But no, a propagator with a lid with ventilation can make such a difference and give you that little head start which you might need on some of your crops, especially things like melons, aubergines, peppers, things which can be a little bit tricky to sow and to grow on the windowsill without any aids.
And is there a sort of best temperature for, I'm going to say, my runner beans that I'm growing? Is it sort of 10 degrees? Is it 20 degrees? Is it 30 degrees? What's the best temperature?
I think with runner beans, I think if you're at sort of 15, 16 degrees, you're going to be pretty well there. But it does depend your ambient temperature in your room. So if you're in a conservatory, the temperature, even at this time of the year can move up to sort of 20, 30, 20, 25 degrees. So in your propagator, that'll be plus probably 4 or 5 degrees.
So they're getting up to 30 now. That's a bit too hot, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's why it's important to vent. But of course, if you're sowing those sort of crops a little bit earlier, then proportionately your temperature might be lower anyway. So yeah, it's always worth getting a little soil thermometer. If budget allows, have a soil thermometer in your propagator, then you can see the actual temperature.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Presumably the packets, do they give you some guidelines?
Indeed, yeah. Always follow the recommendations on the seed packet. They usually give you a between temperature, so try where possible to work to those.
That's a good tip. So thinking about my propagator, obviously it's relatively small, so for me it's very easy to clean. Greenhouses, is that the same? You've got to pressure wash them, do you? Or
if you haven't already, a lot of us will have probably at the end of last season given a bit of an autumn clean. However, during the winter, especially this winter, because it's been relatively mild, although we had a fairly cold snap, you do get things like algae and lichens and lichens and all sorts of things growing on your wooden structures, and obviously you get materials growing on your staging. So it's worth, if you can, just give the greenhouse another, probably a spring clean, shall we say. Lots of good products on the market. We used to have, obviously, the likes of Jeyes Fluid.
Yep.
The trouble is with Jeyes Fluid, you would have to obviously remove everything from your greenhouse to use that. But there are products like...
Because that's used as an algaecide as well, isn't
it?
It
is.
From memory, you can clean your paving slabs down with it to stop you slipping on your paving.
Yeah, which
so
again, if you...
probably... it doesn't do your tomato seedlings.
No. Indeed. And obviously having to take, leave everything outside the greenhouse whilst the weather is so variable might be tricky. But the Agrolon Citrox greenhouse disinfectants, which we sell, which is based, it's an organic, basically an organic clean.
So Citrox probably is it a lemon-based one?
It is. Smells nice. Yeah, it'll good, and it will clean well. And obviously, scrub the glass. Remember, during the winter you get algae growing outside as well, so make sure you clean outside as well as in, and all those nooks and crannies, because you might have overwintering pests and diseases there as well. So, a spring clean if it was missed in the autumn, or you think it needs just another quick check over at this time of year, won't do any harm at all.
And that'll presumably increase your light levels if you clean all your glass, and that's beneficial for all of the seedlings trying to grow.
Especially if you do lots of propagation, it is essential. And also, bear in mind as well, you might have fittings, you might have had insulation in during the winter as well. Obviously, strip that out, give that a clean, ready for later on in the year as well.
Okay. So the daffodils are all out at the moment. I know driving to work, I see lots of lovely clumps of all the different colours of daffodil. They're not just the plain yellow ones now, are they?
No, indeed.
White ones and the yellow with the sort of orangey centres. There's a good different array of daffodils now. Are we too late for planting the sort of summer lilies and things like that now, or have we still got time?
We've got time. Sort of in the last few weeks of the season. So grab your gladioli and your begonias and your the dahlia tubers. But actually, Peter, just going back to those narcissi, which have been looking fantastic, haven't they, this spring? Yeah. There's a few little things we can do for those to make sure that their display looks good next season.
What's that?
It's actually doing a bit of feeding.
Okay.
Now, traditionally, I remember the Royal Horticultural Society many years ago did a bit of a research whether you should cut the foliage off your daffodils, or you should just take the growing, obviously the spent flowers off, or you should knot them. Knotted daffodils. Yeah. And the thoughts were, they did some research, and the magic number is 6 weeks. So 6 weeks after your daffodils fade, mark that onto your calendar, on your planner, and once those 6 weeks have elapsed, you can do two things. Through that whole process of that 6 weeks, you can give them a feed, so a bit of a high potash feed. So sulphate of potash is our usual go-to fertilizer there. And then once that 6 weeks has elapsed, you can get the secateurs out and you can cut your daffodils right back to the soil.
And that'll make no difference to them flowering next year.
Yeah, it's 6 weeks is all the time the plant needs, once that flower is faded, to bulk up the bulb, and that's why it's important. In fact, it's critical we give our daffodils a feed. And probably easier said than done. If they're naturalised in the lawn, you're going to be feeding your lawn, which is obviously sort of counterproductive. However, in your borders, if you've got nice borders, or if you've got them in pots and you move your pots around in your garden, give them a good feed at that stage, and that will really bring the plants into fruition for next year.
That's a good tip. Thanks, Chris. And something I learnt recently was about dividing your clumps of snowdrops up. When should we be thinking about doing that?
Yep. So that's that process is called lifting in the green.
Right.
So once the snowdrops have started to fade, then they're most receptive to being lifted, divided, split, and then replanted. They'll establish much quicker, and it means you'll get a really good display sort of next year. So
you lift them, you split them, and do you then let them sort of dry out and then replant them, or do you replant them immediately?
You try and do it pretty well immediately. So have an idea where you're going to be planting them to, get the soil prepared, and obviously put a little dusting of something like bloodfish and bone, or even just a bit of bone meal, or you might use one of the mycorrhizal products like root grow where you're going to put them, and then maybe just slightly space them out in their new homes, and then they'll bulk up quite well. You can also use that process for winter aconites, those wonderful yellow winter aconites, and you can use the same process again in a few weeks' time when our bluebells have put on their show too. So all the really spring bulk items where we want in quantities of flower.
So we want big clumps of them to have a real big impact. And
the time is straight after the flowers. So as those flowers are starting to fade, you've got a probably 2 or 3 week window to do that process, and you'll have some really good displays the following year.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Chris.
Okay.
So my grass has started growing and got the lawnmower out last week. It wasn't raining and gave my lawn the first cut.
Yep.
Generally, I put it on sort of not quite the highest setting, but not far off. So I'm just taking the very tops off at this time of the year.
Yes,
that's right.
It is. Yeah, you don't want to be scalping the lawn basically. So setting the lawn at that height is good. And how often do you normally cut your lawn, Peter?
Generally in the sort of growing season, so from maybe a month's time, about once a week, once every 10 days. And I know that's my regime. I know sort of on the cricket pitches you see the groundsman going out and mowing the lawn every day, 2 days. And I know some people leave it even longer than I do and do it every couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Any rules of thumb as to...
No, I think you've just got to let the lawn work with you, really, and obviously lifestyles as well, isn't it? But I think you've got a reasonable regular pattern, then I think you'll find that your lawn will look obviously a lot better. It'll look a lot greener. And the trouble is, if you let it get too high, then of course when you do come to remove it, even if you've got it on a lower setting,
you get those yellow patches.
Indeed, which looks pretty awful, really. But
certainly, I know that's sort because even the first time just cutting it the first time this year, there's certain areas that do look a little bit yellower than others. But I try and feed it, and I noticed we've got a new product on the shop floor this year, Mo Bacter. That's a more natural sort of product than some of the other ones that we've got, because I know in the autumn I generally use an autumn food, and then in the sort of spring summer I try and get rid of my moss with evergreen. This year I think I'm going to give this Mo Bacter a try. Can you tell us a bit?
Yeah, so I think it works on the principle that it increases the soil's fertility, so it makes the lawn grow better, faster, healthier.
Yeah, because it's an organic product as well, which I was really pleased to see. So
it sort of pushes the moss out of the equation, really, because of its vigour, which is really good.
So it makes my grass outcompete my moss.
Yes.
Wow, that'll be a first.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously is a problem, and obviously when you look back historically to why you might get moss in your lawn, usually it's drainage, isn't it? Or especially after a wet winter, which we've had, or sort of had, certainly over the last few years. So, I mean, if you can get out there and obviously do a little bit of general lawn prepping, you might have to get the scarifier out and get rid of some of that.
Yeah, or the rakers, I can remember.
Yeah, backbreaking as it is.
It's hard work, but I have done it a few times, and it does. I'm always amazed at how much sort of moss you pull out, even in the patches where you don't even know it's growing.
Indeed, that's it. I think it's just combined. I mean, I think it's important that, remember, once we get into the late spring and early summer, we do get dry spells. Obviously, moss by nature will sort of die out anyway, because especially if you've used the Mo Bacter, you've got a nice strong sward of roots of the turf there, really getting down there. So I think keep addressing that and keep the lawnmower going, and obviously just enjoy the lawn as well. And if you have to do any reseeding,
I was going to say, down by my allotment gate, I've got a few patches of mud in my lawn again. Can I resow them yet? Or?
Yeah, no, it's perfect time. Again, I always think April showers, propagation months. That's when I was at college. We always taught that April is a really good month. You get warming temperatures, a warm soil, plenty of moisture around. So so maybe if you've got patches over there, then get a rake it over, disturb the soil, maybe get some bit of John in his seed and cutting compost. If you've got some of that hand, just sieve that over the area and sieve it so it goes into the existing lawn around it as well. So you blend. So when you come to put your lawn seed down, if you're using sort of a general purpose, Johnson seed, just apply that nice and thickly. Remember, when you're applying lawn seed, you're applying half to actually grow and half perhaps to feed the birds. So make sure you...
Because this is something I was going to ask you about, Chris, because when I sow my bird seed, yes, definitely you see the birds on it the next day. But am I right in thinking I'm meant to put the seed on top of the compost? Because I can't mix it in with the compost and sort of hide the seed that way.
No, unfortunately, it
does.
does
Needs
always
the light, does it, to germinate?
It always seems to do better on the soil, which is obviously a problem because obviously it then dries out. So you do need to get the watering can or the hose pipe out with a fine rose or an end attachment where you can sort of shower over there. But in this time of the year, once those temperatures sort of hit sort of 16, 18 degrees, then germination should be about 10 days. So they should move quite quickly.
Okay, so don't have to water it for too long.
No,
although
indeed.
Presumably with all new grown plants, you're best to water it throughout the first season.
Most that would be a good rule of thumb. And remember, when your lawn seed has come through and it's probably about 3 or 4 inches tall, then get a nice pair of sharp shears and just take the tips off. Just tip the try and avoid running your lawnmower over that little area if you can.
Okay.
Use a pair of shears, just take the tips out to encourage the plants to till from the bottom to produce new shoots from the base, which then you'll start to get a nice thick bit of new lawn.
Chris, I'm so looking forward to our next show. A couple of years ago, Manos from Growth Technology came in and did a talk about how to look after orchids, and I listened to the talk and I came away with a few really simple but good ideas. And this year, for the first year ever, all 3 of my orchids have come into flower.
Fantastic.
At the same time.
Wow, that's good.
They're looking really good. I'm really pleased with them.
Right.
Any sort of things that we should be thinking about for houseplants this time of the year?
Yeah, houseplants in general. Yes, I think this is that time of the year when we start to think about, as the days are getting longer, obviously warmer, maybe some of them might need a repot. So I think a lot of your foliage plants might need just checking. So obviously the easiest way to do that, or maybe the easiest way, depending on the size of your houseplant, is obviously check the base, the drainage hole, see if there's roots coming out there. Maybe if you can, carefully knock the plant out of its pot just to establish what sort of stage of root growth you've got. And if it's looking like the pot is completely full of roots, then the time has come to move the plant up a couple of pot sizes. Generally, foliage plants and some of your flowering plants will benefit from that. It'll just give them a new lease of life. It'll give them some more space to grow in, so hopefully it'll increase a bit of bulk, especially on your foliage plants. But also, more importantly, keep the plant nice and healthy. It'll keep it nice and strong.
I'm thinking about compost. Can I use my Jack's Magic on my houseplants, or do I need a proper houseplant compost?
Yeah, I think houseplants is probably worth just maybe either go for a houseplant compost, or if you use a multi-purpose compost, get yourself some like perlite.
Okay, just to mix in with it and lighten it up a bit.
That's it. It can be, the trouble is some of these more general purpose composts are a little bit on the heavy side. I think houseplants a little bit more delicate, shall we say, around the root zone, so they would benefit from that. So maybe 10% perlite to a multi-purpose compost, and lightly to work it well through your fingers so it feels quite spongy and not too wet.
Presumably, are there sort of ericaceous houseplants? Do we have to consider that with any houseplants?
We do, yes, good point. So you've got the likes of gardenias, and I think probably gardenias. Stephanotis are sort of borderline acidic as well, but gardenias especially. And obviously, if you go for things like African violets, they have a special compost as well. So, have a little look at...
citrus plants as well, don't they?
That's it.
So, I guess the rule of thumb then might be that if you're going to repot your houseplant, pay a little bit of attention to what you're going to pot it in with.
And obviously, look out for any specialist compost. If you've got a nice collection of citrus, or you've got quite a few gardenias and other such plants which need those, maybe worth investing in a bag of that. Or compost would make a lot of sense.
And then hopefully your gardenias will flower again soon and give you that lovely scent in your house.
They will. They're a tricky plant, gardenias. I love them, but they can be a bit tricky. They need humidity. They need moisture in the air as well, which can be a bit difficult. But for those houseplants which don't need repotting, maybe you can really start feeding your plants at this time of the year. So have a proper...
And that's Baby Bio. I mean, that's the one that
I've
seen on the shelves all my life. It's a classic...
It is, and it's really good. And it was developed in the 1950s and 60s. It was developed in Cheshunt down in Hertfordshire, and it tied in with Rochford's houseplants. They did at the time they were the main houseplant suppliers to the florists and soon garden centres, and they manufactured Baby Bio on the basis of a high nitrogen feed.
Okay, so remind me, nitrogen makes the foliage grow well, doesn't it?
Yeah, spot on. So you've got the likes of Swiss cheese plants, rubber plants, Scindapsus, all the foliage plants which are so popular now once again will benefit from those sort of feeds. And on a regular basis, I would be feeding once every 7 to 10 days from now right through till sort of September, October. So working with the extended day length.
And that's with rainwater over tap water, and is there any sort of tepid, is it as well?
Yeah, tepid water is always good, and rainwater would be even better, especially on your Ericaceous sort of plants too. But it's not it's not the be all and end all if you can't or you haven't got the rainwater saved.
Essential.
It's not essential now, but
giving them water probably is essential.
It is, yeah. But as I say, we as a nature of gardeners, we tend to be overzealous with the watering. So if you can, try and keep the plants on give them a really good water in, especially if you're repotting, and then let the oxygen get to those roots in between waterings.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Okay. So, Chris, our next show, what are we going to be covering?
So it's really exciting, actually, because we've got Manos from Growth Technology, no less, with us, and we're going to be talking orchids, but we'll also be looking at other houseplants as well. We'll try and keep it a very indoor edition of the podcast.
Excellent. That sounds like fun. Our thanks today goes to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music for our show.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.